Hey guys, welcome back to Animal Encounters. Today, I've pulled up several cases of tourists who mocked and ignored rules and then got mauled by deadly animals. From a tourist who ignored an escort for one last sunset photo to two tourists who booked the cheapest cage dive available and climbed into a rusted cage with a 16-foot great white circling outside. It was August 6, 2014. The river cut through dense mangrove flats in the Northern Territory of Australia, narrow in places, wide and slow in others, the banks so thick with vegetation you couldn't see more than a few feet into the tree line. The water was dark, tannin-stained, completely opaque. The dry season had pulled the water level down about 2 feet from its wet season peak, concentrating everything, fish, birds, and crocodiles, into a tighter stretch of the main channel. Pressa Weiland was 29, a freelance travel writer from Austin, Texas. She was in Australia on a self-funded research trip documenting small independent tour operators. The river tour was her third activity of the week, booked through a local guide running two-person canoe tours out of a small riverside launch point. Her paddling experience was limited to calm lake kayaking. She'd told the guide this up front. He said the river was calm and the tour was beginner-friendly. She took his word for it, which honestly, given what this river was the first mistake. Saltwater crocodiles are the largest living reptiles on Earth. Adult males average 14 to 17 feet and between 1,000 and 1,500 pounds. Their bite force exceeds 3,700 pounds per square inch. They are ambush predators that use a death roll to disorient and drown prey. A rapid full-body rotation that tears tissue and pulls the victim under almost instantly. In the Northern Territory, attacks on small watercraft are documented, especially during the dry season when animals concentrate in the main channel. A large resident male had been logged in that exact section of the river 4 days before this tour. The guide hadn't checked the sighting log. Pressa definitely hadn't either. She had no reason to know it existed. The guide spotted a large crocodile basking on the left bank about 400 feet ahead and pointed it out like it was a selling point of the tour. He paddled right to give it distance. The crocodile slid into the water as they approached. The guide called it normal behavior. Pressa went quiet and started watching both sides of the water. What neither of them knew was that a second crocodile, larger, had been sitting completely still in the shallows on the right bank, the side they'd just moved toward. Pressa caught a slow ripple moving toward the canoe from the right, about 30 feet out. She pointed. The guide turned to look. The crocodile hit the right side of the canoe at mid-hull, hard enough to crack the fiberglass along the gunnel. Before either of them could do anything, its jaws closed over the right gunnel at the front, right in front of Pressa. The canoe started rolling right. She grabbed both sides of the hull, but it was already too far gone, and she went into the water. The crocodile released the canoe and was on her within seconds, jaws closing across her right arm and shoulder, immediately going into a death roll. A full rapid rotation that wrenched the shoulder joint and pulled her straight under. The guide was screaming and hitting the water with his paddle. The crocodile surfaced briefly about 20 feet downstream, then went under. Pressa didn't come back up. The guide managed to paddle the damaged, half-flooded canoe to the nearest bank and activated the personal locator beacon he had clipped to his vest. A response team reached him by motorboat about 40 minutes later. He was physically unharmed, but not in good shape. A search of the river started immediately. Pressa's body was recovered the following morning about 600 feet downstream, partially concealed under submerged root structure along the left bank. Crocodiles cache prey in spots like that. Cause of death was drowning. The death roll had pulled her under, and she never came back up. The traumatic loss of her right arm at the shoulder was a contributing factor, but the drowning killed her. The guide's operation was found to be running without a current wildlife activity permit for that stretch of river, and he hadn't checked the sighting log that recorded the large resident male 4 days prior. Death ruled accidental, the beacon's time-stamped signal, canoe damage consistent with large crocodile bites, and the guide's written account were all recovered as evidence. It was February 14th, 2018, and morning sun turned the sandbars of the Exuma Quays into ribbons of white against surrounding turquoise. The water was flat and warm, the visibility exceptional. A small boat idled near a shallow sandbar where a swim with sharks snorkeling operation had been running tours for 3 seasons, attracting Caribbean reef sharks with fish scraps for tourists to observe from the water. The sandbar sat adjacent to a drop-off shelf where chest-deep turquoise transitioned to deep open blue within a short distance. The operation had grown popular through word of mouth and social media, drawing visitors who wanted the experience of swimming alongside sharks without the barrier of a cage or a boat hull between them. Hadley Pemberton was a 41-year-old marketing executive from Scottsdale, Arizona, on a Valentine's trip with her partner. An inexperienced snorkeler who had completed a resort certification course the day before, Pemberton had booked the shark encounter as a surprise. Her partner, uncomfortable with the idea of entering the water alongside sharks, stayed on the boat and watched from the stern. The tour was guided by Cedrian Roll, a 34-year-old Bahamian who had grown up on these islands and knew the surrounding waters well. He kept his boat idling nearby at all times, engine running, positioned for quick retrieval if conditions changed. His safety record was clean, and previous tours had operated without serious incident. Roll briefed the group of 6 before entering the water. Stay together, remain horizontal, avoid splashing, stay well away from the drop-off edge, and exit immediately on his signal. The session proceeded normally for 15 minutes. Several reef sharks between 4 and 6 feet circled the group, drawn by the fish scraps. Pemberton drifted toward the sandbar edge, where the water deepened sharply, moving 10 to 15 yards from the nearest swimmer, isolating herself at the transition zone where the sandy bottom dropped away. Roll signaled her to return. She waved acknowledgement but continued positioning for a photograph. The chum slick had been drifting toward deeper water for 20 minutes, carrying scent well beyond the sandbar zone and toward the drop-off. What I find unsettling about these chum operations is the part nobody talks about. You're putting blood and fish scraps in the water to attract sharks, then putting people in the same water. The whole model depends on only the right sharks showing up, and the ocean doesn't make that guarantee. Bull sharks are among the most dangerous shark species to humans, combining aggressive territorial behavior with a preference for shallow coastal waters and reef margins. Adults commonly reach 8 feet and weigh between 200 and 400 pounds. They patrol drop-off edges as feeding corridors and typically bump a target before committing to a bite. An 8-foot bull shark entered the transition zone near the sandbar edge, likely drawn by a combination of the drifting chum scent, movement in the water, and the contrast of a lone figure isolated from the group. Roll recognized the stockier profile and aggressive movement pattern, consistent with a bull shark, and signaled everyone out. The 5 tourists near the group moved towards the boat. Pemberton was slow to respond. The bull shark approached and bumped her leg, a firm investigatory contact that nearly knocked her off her feet. She panicked, splashing and kicking toward the shallows. The shark circled briefly, made one more close pass, then committed. According to Roll's testimony and passenger accounts, the bite struck her lower body. The serrated teeth opened deep lacerations through muscle and tissue, severing the femoral artery. The shark released and circled away. Pemberton remained conscious initially, but collapsed within seconds as blood loss accelerated, unable to stay upright in the waist-to-chest deep shallows. She struggled to keep her head above the surface for nearly a minute before losing consciousness. Roll, having loaded the last swimmer, reached her shortly after. Waist-to-chest deep water. That's the part my mind keeps snagging on. She wasn't in the deep ocean. She was standing on sand at the edge of the drop-off, and it still wasn't shallow enough to save her. Pemberton was pulled aboard, but unresponsive, blood loss compounded by inhaling water during her struggle. She was pronounced dead during transport to the nearest clinic. The investigation confirmed the bull shark had followed the drifting chum toward the drop-off, where Pemberton had been standing alone. Roll's operation was suspended. Authorities cited the proximity of chum to a drop-off shelf and inadequate protocols for monitoring tourist positions relative to deeper water.
It was September 2, 2016, and the dry season had pulled enormous numbers of elephants toward the Chobe riverfront in northern Botswana. Every remaining water source was crowded from morning until dark, breeding herds moving between the river and the tree line in long gray columns. For photographers, this is basically the best elephant viewing on the planet, and that is exactly what Preston Medeiros had flown across the world for. Medeiros was a 34-year-old marketing executive from Denver, Colorado, traveling on a private mobile safari with an experienced guide named Kagiso Nintsimane, 38, who had been working the northern parks for over a decade. Medeiros was also a serious drone hobbyist, and he had packed a professional photography drone worth several $1,000s in a hard case that took up half his luggage allowance. His social feeds back home were full of aerial footage, and the entire point of this trip was adding African wildlife to the collection. Nitsimane spotted the case on day one and told him plainly that drones are prohibited in the parks, no exceptions, the permits basically do not exist for tourists. Medeiros nodded along and the case stayed shut for 3 days, but it kept riding in the vehicle anyway, which probably should have told Nitsimane something. The first days delivered everything else: lion, buffalo, sable, wild dogs on a kill. And through all of it, the case sat in the back like a held breath. On the evening of the second, they stopped at a designated sundowner point above the river. A breeding herd of more than 20 elephants, several calves among them, was drinking roughly 120 to 150 yards away. The light was going gold, and it was exactly the aerial shot Medeiros had been imagining for months. While Nitsimane set up drinks behind the vehicle, Medeiros quietly lifted the drone out, set it on the ground, and launched it. A grown man looked at a herd of elephants with babies, looked at a toy he paid a few $1,000s for, and decided the toy was worth the risk. I honestly don't know what to call that except a trade. He lost. The herd reacted almost immediately. The buzzing and the movement overhead drew the attention of the adults, and within seconds, several cows had shifted around the calves and begun assessing the disturbance. Ears went out, trunks lifting to scent the air, and agitation moved through the group fast. Nitsimane heard the buzzing, came around the vehicle already shouting, and watched the drone clip a mopane branch on a low pass and spin down into the scrub about 40 to 50 yards out, roughly halfway between the vehicle and a herd that was now thoroughly agitated. Medeiros was over the side of the vehicle and walking before Nitsimane could physically stop him. He apparently said something over his shoulder about it taking 30 seconds, and those were close to the last words anyone heard from him. African elephants are the largest land animals on Earth, with breeding herds led by matriarchs whose overriding drive is the protection of calves. A charging elephant can reach 25 miles per hour, far beyond any human sprint, and warning displays may be shortened or bypassed entirely when calves are perceived to be at risk. An agitated herd that is already bunched defensively is a herd that has skipped the early steps. A person on foot near it has no margin at all. He was crouched over the wreckage when the matriarch broke from the group 40 yards, disappeared in seconds. Nitsimane shouted, laid on the vehicle horn, and brought his rifle up but could not safely intervene before impact. The angle had Medeiros directly in line with the herd. She knocked Medeiros to the ground, trampled him, and delivered at least one tusk strike before turning back toward the herd, and then she was shepherding them away with the calves tucked in the middle. The crushing chest injuries were fatal within moments, and he died at the scene before any evacuation was possible. The nearest airstrip was 40 minutes away, and it would not have mattered if it had been 4. Authorities documented the prohibited drone use and both of Nitsimane's warnings, and the guide was fully cleared. The safari operator added a written drone ban to its booking forms the same season, which tells you everything about how preventable this one was. If he had stayed in his seat and reported the crash, park staff would have likely have dealt with the drone later. And the absolute worst case scenario was flying home without his expensive, stupid toy. It was November 11th, 2018, in Central Texas. November in the hill country comes in cold and fast, temperatures dropping after dark in ways that catch people off guard, and a night sky so dark it makes you feel genuinely cut off from everything familiar. Storms build across the plains and arrive without much warning. On the night Trevor Boone drove out to the zoo, the weather had already turned before the forecasts said it would. Trevor Brown was 46 years old, an oil field mechanic from West Texas, who trusted his ability to read a situation and adjust. He preferred smaller zoos over large commercial destinations, off-grid experiences, the kind of nighttime safari a standard zoo wouldn't offer. He had booked a Predator night tour at a small drive-through zoo for November 2018. The zoo's newest attraction was a 430-pound Siberian tiger hybrid, housed behind electrified fencing in a wooded enclosure. The animal had been recently acquired and was still establishing its behavior patterns in an unfamiliar space. Staff had already documented repeated generator failures causing intermittent outages along sections of the perimeter in the weeks preceding the tour. That information sat in internal logs. It did not affect the booking calendar. Siberian tiger hybrids are among the largest felids held in captivity, capable of dragging prey several times their own body weight through dense terrain. They are solitary ambush predators that become measurably more reactive during feeding periods, showing elevated alertness, a reduced threshold for movement stimuli, and an increased territorial response. The evening of Trevor's tour was a scheduled feeding night, which, to me, immediately raises the question of why visitors were there at all. If you know an animal is more reactive during feeding, why add more variables to the situation? The variables assembled by the time he arrived: a feeding period, an unstable electrical perimeter, a recently acquired animal in an unfamiliar enclosure, paying visitors moving through the property in the dark, had each been documented separately. They had never been assessed together. The storms knocked out portions of the backup electrical system before the tour began. Staff attempted emergency repairs using portable battery units while the tour proceeded. The decision to continue rather than postpone was made without formal consultation. The tiger moved through a section of perimeter fencing where current had dropped below the threshold needed to deter the animal. By the time the breach was identified, it had already entered the brush surrounding the safari trail. Trevor had stepped out of his vehicle to assist another guest with a jammed door when the tiger emerged from between parked vehicles near the trail entrance. Visibility was near zero. Response teams could not establish the animal's position before contact was made. Trevor died from his injuries before armed staff reached the scene. Criminal negligence inquiries launched almost immediately. Investigators found that the generator failure pattern had been documented across multiple prior incidents and that no formal protocol existed for which activities should be suspended when perimeter power was compromised. The feeding schedule had not been adjusted despite the outage. The tour had not been paused despite the known behavioral elevation during feeding periods. The zoo lost its operating license. Trevor had chosen a smaller zoo, specifically because it offered something a large commercial park wouldn't. What it also offered, and what he had no way of knowing, was a gap between what its safety systems claimed to provide and what they could actually deliver when the weather turned and the lights went out. On the 11th of September 2015, a family safari trip through central India was supposed to celebrate a major milestone. After Kiran completed his environmental science degree studying wildlife behavior, his father finally fulfilled a 2-year promise to visit one of India's famous tiger reserves together. The family traveled from Chennai to a tiger reserve deep in central Madhya Pradesh, one of the most active tiger corridors in India. Devraj, 46, approached the trip carefully. He booked through licensed operators, followed official reserve procedures, and made sure the safari was arranged with a registered guide. His wife, Priya, and their 17-year-old daughter, Meera, joined them for the journey. By the second morning of the safari, the family had already settled comfortably into the experience. The monsoon forest felt dense, but earlier calm sightings made Kiran confident. His academic knowledge of tigers increased his comfort despite subtle warning signs. The open-sided jeep required strict seating near predators, but Kiran repeatedly stood to photograph over the roofline. Each time nothing happened, his confidence grew, making the risky behavior feel increasingly normal and safe. I think confidence was slowly convincing him the rule didn't really matter. Late morning, the jeep crept through a narrow forest trail, branches brushing the vehicle as the family scanned dense vegetation. Then the jeep stopped suddenly. The guide had seen movement in the undergrowth to the left of the trail. At first, the family could barely make out the shape through the vegetation. Then, an enormous adult male tiger stepped silently from the greenery into partial view. The animal stood roughly 25 feet from the jeep. For a moment, everything became completely still. The tiger was massive orange fur, darkened by moisture. Heavy shoulders rolling beneath striped muscle. Its eyes fixed directly on the vehicle, but its posture was calm. It was not growling or crouching aggressively. Close-range sightings of tigers near safari vehicles were not uncommon, though most ended without incident. The guide quietly instructed everyone to remain seated and still. To me, that's the moment the guide understood the risk better than anyone else in the vehicle. But Kieran was already lifting his camera. Wanting a clearer shot above the side railing, he slowly rose from his seat. There was a half-second of frozen silence before the guide shouted at him to sit down. When Kieran rose above the Jeep's profile, the tiger's attention shifted sharply toward the sudden vertical movement. It was not only the height change, the movement itself against the jungle backdrop altered what the animal had been watching. The tiger's focus tightened. Its posture changed almost imperceptibly at first, then it moved. The tiger surged forward in a rapid burst from the edge of the trail. It covered the distance before most people inside the Jeep had fully processed that it had started moving at all. There was no extended charge, no buildup. The animal simply reacted and closed the gap. The strike caught Kieran across the chest and upper arm with enormous force. He was knocked sideways instantly, his upper body slamming against the opposite railing before he toppled over the side and hit the muddy trail below. The camera struck the floor of the Jeep. Priya screamed. Devraj lunged toward the railing while the guide reached beneath the front seat for a noise deterrent. Some safari guides carried for emergencies a bundle of firecrackers. The sharp cracking blasts echoed through the forest in rapid succession. The tiger flinched back from the noise. For a brief moment, it hesitated near the edge of the trail where Kieran had fallen. The guide fired another burst. The animal turned, paused once more, and then disappeared back into the undergrowth in seconds. The forest went quiet again except for Priya's voice and the sound of the idling engine. Kieran was still on the ground beside the Jeep. The guide immediately radioed reserve staff while Devraj climbed down to reach his son. Emergency teams arrived quickly and transported Kieran to medical facilities, but the injuries from the impact and the strike itself were severe. He died before the day was over. The post-incident investigation found that the guide had followed reserve protocol correctly throughout the encounter. Officials confirmed that the tiger's reaction began only after Kieran stood above the vehicle railing despite repeated safety instructions to remain seated. The incident was formally categorized as a fatality resulting from violation of established safari safety guidelines. Kieran understood tiger behavior academically, but facing a fully grown tiger nearby turned theoretical knowledge into immediate physical danger within seconds. It was October 5th, 2018, and the backcountry of northwestern Wyoming was in the first serious days of fall. The trail system at altitude had taken on the quiet of a season that had cleared out most of its foot traffic. It was not empty. It was a bear, a carcass, and a zone of territory the bear had claimed and was defending at a biological intensity that wildlife managers place in a specific and well-documented category. Personnel from a local wildlife management office had located a grizzly bear, actively guarding a large elk carcass approximately a quarter-mile from a primary trail junction. The bear had been at the carcass for more than 2 days. Closure signs had been placed at every access point. Staff had been physically deployed to the main trailheads with instructions to turn visitors back. The boundary had been positioned with buffer distance built in, ensuring that a hiker who stopped at the signs was well outside the zone where the bear's behavior would shift from tolerance to aggression. Signs, staff, buffer distance, specific information, all of it in place before anyone arrived. Brenda Collins was 58 years old. She had organized this trip in advance, and the closure she encountered at the trailhead did not reach her as information about confirmed, specific, proximate danger. It reached her as interference with a plan she had already finalized. She bypassed the closure and entered the restricted area. I've thought about framing the closure a lot as interference rather than information. It's a cognitive move a lot of us are capable of making when we've committed hard enough to a plan. The plan feels real. The sign feels like an obstacle. The bear at that moment doesn't feel real at all. A grizzly bear in possession of a large carcass in the weeks preceding denning is in the most food-protective behavioral state the species produces. Caloric requirements reach approximately 20,000 calories per day, and behavior is comprehensively reorganized around the acquisition and protection of food. The response does not begin with a warning phase. The bear is already in maximum resource protection mode when the intruder arrives, and the outcome resolves in a single direction, with the consistency wildlife professionals professionals treat as a defining characteristic of this encounter type. The closure perimeter mapped directly onto the zone where this behavior was active. The signs did not describe a general risk in a general area. They described a specific bear, a specific carcass, a specific location, and the specific consequence of entering the space between them. Brenda covered several miles into the restricted zone. The trail moved through a natural drainage corridor that funneled toward the carcass site, and the terrain features flanking it compressed the range at which the bear would detect her approach. A hyperphagia phase grizzly defending a carcass does not issue a visible warning before engaging. The bear is present, and then the bear is moving, and the distance between those two states is a fraction of a second. The bear charged at full speed. The contact was explosive. The full forward momentum of a 400+ pound animal delivered through the forepaws, driving Brenda to the ground immediately. Biting was applied to the head, neck, and upper torso. The forepaws raked repeatedly across the back and shoulders. Brenda was alone. There was no mechanism available to interrupt the sequence, and the attack ran to the point where the bear registered that the threat had been neutralized and returned to the carcass. When Brenda failed to return, a search was organized. The investigation required no complex reconstruction. The closure signs were where they had been placed. The trailhead staffing logs were complete. The trail into the restricted zone showed a single set of boot prints moving inward. That detail one set of prints moving toward the thing every system in place had been designed to keep her away from is the image from this entire series that stays with me longest. Trail closures and active wildlife management are not the product of excessive caution. They are posted when someone with training and situational authority has walked into the terrain, located the specific animal, assessed the behavioral conditions, and drawn a boundary at the exact point where the biology makes the outcome non-negotiable. The closure Brenda walked past was not a map of where a bear might be. It was a map of where one was, what it was doing, and what would happen if someone entered the space between the warning and the carcass. All of that information was at the trailhead, in writing, at every access point, reinforced by physical staff. The information did not fail. Brenda Collins walked past it and into the outcome it had been placed there to prevent.
It was March 3rd, 2017. The property was in Central Florida, a privately owned stretch of land set up as a so-called big cat sanctuary. It sat back from the main road behind a tree line, hand-painted signs pointing the way. In, a gravel parking lot, and chain-link enclosures running along a dirt walking path. Not exactly what you'd picture when you hear the word sanctuary. Aldrich Fenn was 41, a high school PE teacher from Gainesville. He'd visited once before and had been talking about going back ever since. He came alone this time. His wife had declined, said the place gave her a bad feeling. Aldrich wasn't reckless, but he was enthusiastic. The kind of guy who got a little too close to things because he was genuinely fascinated by them. He'd already been redirected once by staff earlier that day for pressing up against one of the enclosure fences. What he didn't know was that the fencing along the east path had been flagged 3 weeks earlier for a compromised anchor post, and nobody had fixed it. Bengal tigers average 9 to 10 feet long and between 400 and 550 pounds for adult males. Bite force around 1,050 pounds per square inch. They're ambush predators. They close the gap fast and low and go straight for the back of the neck. The tiger in enclosure 4 was an adult male, around 7 years old, and had been pacing the east fence line since early that morning. Staff logged the behavior, but put it down to a disrupted feeding schedule. 2 other visitors earlier had watched the tiger press its full weight against the lower fence section. Neither said anything. I've seen this come up so many times. Someone notices something off and just keeps walking. Aldrich reached the east path around 2:40 p.m., alone. He stopped at enclosure 4, ignored the do not touch sign posted directly on the fence, crouched down, and pushed his arm through the chain link up to the elbow to get a low-angle shot. The tiger was about 6 feet away and had been watching him since he stopped. The anchor post gave out the moment the tiger put its full weight against the base. The bottom section of chain link peeled outward, an 18-inch gap at ground level. The tiger was through it in under 2 seconds. Aldrich was still crouched when the animal hit him, a full strike to the upper back and right shoulder that drove him face first into the ground. The tiger repositioned immediately, jaws closing on the back of his neck. He was dragged about 14 feet along the path before the animal stopped. A staff member heard the impact and came around the corner within 30 to 40 seconds. The tiger was stationary, holding Aldrich by the neck and upper back. The staff member used a CO2 horn. The animal released and moved back toward the gap on its own. A call went out at around 2:47 p.m., and first responders arrived roughly 14 minutes later. Aldrich hadn't moved since the first bite. Aldrich Fenn was pronounced dead at the scene. Cause of death was a cervical fracture at the C2 vertebra, immediately fatal. Secondary findings included deep lacerations across the upper back, a fractured right clavicle, and significant soft tissue loss. Given everything else in this story, that might be the one detail that doesn't make it worse. The facility was shut down within days. Inspectors found 3 more fence sections with compromised anchor posts across the property. The maintenance record showing the east fence repair had been scheduled and skipped was recovered, along with the logbook noting the tiger's abnormal behavior that morning. The tiger was transferred to a licensed facility. The owner faced civil proceedings, and the death was ruled accidental. It was July 19, 2016, and the Southern Hemisphere winter had brought cold, nutrient-rich currents along the western Cape of South Africa. Water temperatures had dropped into the low 50s, concentrating Cape fur seals on the rocky shores of Dyer Island and drawing great white sharks from across the region into the narrow channel between the island and the mainland that locals called Shark Alley. The area's reputation as one of the most reliable great white viewing locations on Earth had spawned a competitive cage diving industry, with operators ranging from fully licensed commercial outfits to budget charters running on thin margins and thinner safety standards. Lorcan Mertens was a 34-year-old mechanical engineer from Antwerp, Belgium, 3 weeks into a trip through southern Africa. An experienced recreational diver with over 60 logged dives, Mertens had booked the cheapest operator available online, despite mixed reviews. The price difference of nearly 40% had made the decision easy. Anka Dahlqvist, a 29-year-old marine biology graduate student from Uppsala, Sweden, had arrived that morning on a research gap year, documenting shark ecotourism practices along the southern African coast. The reputable operators in the area had been fully booked for the week. The budget charter, run by Jandre Carlson, a 41-year-old South African who served as skipper and owner, was the only operation with availability for that afternoon. Carlson's operation ran chronically understaffed, with himself at the helm and a single inexperienced deckhand, well below the standard crew that reputable operators maintained. He had been cited twice for equipment violations over the previous 3 years. His cage was 7 years old, past its inspection cycle, with visible corrosion on weld joints, addressed with surface-level patching rather than structural repair. The morning departure carried Mertens, Dahlqvist, and 5 other tourists who would remain on deck as observers. The part I can't get past is that the rust was visible. Mertens saw it. He asked about it, and then he climbed in anyway, because the guy who stood to lose money told him it was fine. Mertens noticed the rust on a horizontal crossbar and asked about it. Carlson dismissed it as cosmetic weathering, common to all saltwater equipment. Mertens accepted the explanation and climbed in. Dahlqvist hesitated at the cage door, examining the same discoloration, but followed. The cage was lowered with both divers inside. Carlson deployed an unusually heavy chum slick, the oily mixture spreading across the surface in a wide arc. Within 20 minutes, a large female great white, estimated at over 16 feet, had begun circling the boat. Great white sharks are the ocean's apex predators, with adult females reaching 16 to 20 feet and weights exceeding 4,000 pounds. Their bite generates immense force, and their hunting strategy relies on investigatory contact with unfamiliar objects. The force generated during thrashing can deform metal and displace heavy equipment. The shark made several close passes, bumping the cage in a pattern consistent with standard investigatory behavior. On one approach, it took the bait chunk directly, the piece lodging in its jaws. The bait line, which had drifted closer to the cage than intended, pulled taut against the frame as the animal thrashed violently. Footage from a topside tourist's camera captured portions of what followed, though much of the reconstruction relied on physical evidence and investigator analysis. The thrashing drove the shark's body against the corroded weld joint on the crossbar Mertens had questioned. The weld didn't fail completely. A weakened point gave slightly under-repeated impact, subtly increasing a gap that investigators later found had already been borderline non-compliant with standard bar spacing. The shark's snout slammed against the widened seam as the bait line held the animal against the damaged section. What happened in the seconds that followed was never fully reconstructed. Investigators concluded Mertens likely sustained bite trauma to his right arm during the shark's contact with the cage. Whether his limb was pushed through the gap, caught outside the bars, or injured through the seam could not be determined. The bite severed major blood vessels. The shark wrenched free within seconds. Dahlqvist had been thrown against the opposite cage frame. I've tried to imagine what those seconds were like inside that cage. Steel on every side, nowhere to go, and a 16-foot animal panicking just as badly as you are. The cage was supposed to keep the ocean out. This one just kept them in. The crew hauled the damaged cage to the surface. Mertens was unconscious from catastrophic blood loss by the time the cage broke the surface. The site was over 45 minutes from the harbor. He was pronounced dead before reaching shore. Dahlqvist had sustained severe chest injuries from the impact and had aspirated water during the chaos. She was airlifted to a trauma facility in critical condition and survived, though her recovery took months. What I keep coming back to is the margin. One diver's arm found a gap that shouldn't have existed. The other was on the opposite side of the cage and walked away. Same water, same seconds, completely different outcomes. The investigation found the cage had not been professionally inspected in over 4 years, and that the bait line had been positioned dangerously close to the cage. Carlson's operation was shut down permanently. He faced criminal negligence charges.
It was March 12, 2017, and the late summer heat sat heavy over the Bushveld north of Johannesburg. The private lion park drew a steady stream of self-drive visitors, the kind of place where lions were habituated to vehicles and sightings were common enough that most visitors expected to see lions before finishing the route. Signs were posted at the gate, at the ticket office, and every few hundred yards along the route. Windows closed at all times in the predator camps. And honestly, they could not have made the rule any clearer if they tried. Staff patrol vehicles looped the camps on rotation throughout the day. Matthias Krugman was a 41-year-old software sales manager from Stuttgart, Germany, in the country for a week of client meetings. He had one free afternoon before his flight home and decided to spend it at the Lion Park. Rented sedan, brand new camera he bought specifically for the trip, the whole tourist setup. He had never been on any kind of safari before, and a contained park with guaranteed sightings an hour from his hotel was exactly the level of adventure his schedule allowed. The route through the predator camps ran as a slow one-way loop. Gates between each section and a brochure on the passenger seat repeated the window rule in 4 languages. Krugman drove it the way everybody does, slow, camera in his lap, scanning the shade lines under every tree. The first hour went well. Krugman photographed lions at 3 separate sightings, always through the windshield or the side glass. And every single frame disappointed him. Reflections cutting across the shot, smudges from the rental company's lazy cleaning job, glare wherever the sun hit the window. He kept reviewing the photos on the camera screen and deleting them, and the frustration built a little more at every stop. Shortly after 3, he came around a bend and found what every visitor hopes for. A lioness was stretched out in the shade, just off the roadside, roughly 15 to 20 feet from where his car rolled to a stop, dozing, completely indifferent to the vehicle. Other cars slowed, idled, took their pictures through closed glass, and moved on. He sat there for close to 20 minutes watching her ignore a dozen other cars, and somewhere in those 20 minutes, the rule on all those signs stopped feeling like it applied to this particular cat. The window came down halfway. Nothing happened. The lioness did not even open her eyes, so down it went the rest of the way, and he leaned toward the gap with the lens out in the open air, finally shooting with nothing in the way. The first clean frames of his entire afternoon were on that camera within seconds. African lions are the continent's apex predator, with adult females weighing between 260 and 400 pounds and capable of explosive acceleration over short distances. Lions in vehicle-habituated parks generally perceive a car as one solid object, neither prey nor threat, which is the entire reason self-drive parks can exist at all. An open window with movement inside changes what the animal perceives, breaking that solid outline into something alive. And the change in the animal's assessment can happen in under a second. Her posture changed the moment movement appeared through the opening. Head up, attention suddenly focused on the lens and the shape shifting behind it. The lunge covered the distance before Krugman could react. The lioness caught him across the head and upper neck, one forepaw hooking the window frame as she dragged him violently toward the opening, and the severe trauma happened almost at once. The whole thing took seconds. Witnesses in nearby cars said the car jolted sharply. Krugman disappeared from view, and then it just went still. One driver, 2 cars back, had been filming the lioness through his own closed window and put the camera down to lean on his horn instead. Nearby visitors began sounding their horns immediately. Within several minutes, a patrol vehicle arrived and used vehicle pressure and air horns to drive the lioness off, and she retreated a short distance and remained in the area. Staff keeping firearms ready as a last resort that never became necessary, she eventually moved deeper into the camp. Krugman was dead at the scene. The injuries to the neck were considered immediately life-threatening and likely fatal within minutes. The park suspended the self-drive route and reviewed its procedures. Other visitors who had been parked along the same stretch told investigators his windows had been up at the previous sighting 20 minutes earlier, same as everyone else. The lioness was not destroyed, authorities concluding she had reacted to a broken barrier rather than hunted a person. I genuinely cannot get over the fact that the entire safety system in a predator park comes down to a piece of glass half a centimeter thick, and the only thing between a tourist and a 300-pound cat is whether he feels like pressing a button. It was August 9th, 2014, Southern Arizona. August in the high desert is a study in contradictions, dry heat that the monsoon season has not yet broken, afternoons that press down hard and then, without much warning, turn. The sky goes copper before a storm. The air shifts. Animals feel it before people do. Anita Holt was 17. That detail matters more than it might seem. She was competitive, disciplined, and had qualified for a regional track championship that summer. A person who understood the relationship between structure, preparation, and what you can achieve inside a system that is working properly. Honestly, this girl, she wasn't reckless. She wasn't defiant. She was a teenager on a summer road trip program who stopped at a small zoo and, by all accounts, simply followed every instruction she was given. The zoo housed 3 jaguars used for conservation education events near visitor grounds. Jaguars are the largest cat species in the Americas and possess the strongest bite force of any big cat in the Western Hemisphere, capable of piercing bone and crushing skulls. Unlike most large felids, they do not target the throat. They target the base of the skull. It is a strike pattern that produces death almost instantly and leaves very little window between initial contact and outcome. One of the 3 animals had been relocated to a smaller holding area during zoo renovations earlier that week. Staff had noted it had become measurably more agitated since the move. That information did not reach the people running the public demonstration that afternoon. And I think that's the first detail that should make people uncomfortable. Animals don't need a reason that makes sense to us. If handlers are documenting behavioral changes, that information needs to follow the animal everywhere it goes. The morning's decisions had each made sense in isolation. A handler secured a perimeter gate using only a temporary pin latch. The standard dual lock system was being replaced, and the pin was the interim solution. The choice to proceed with programming while the renovation was active made sense. So did the choice to position visitors near the observation deck while the animal was in a behavioral state its own handlers had already clocked as elevated. None of those individual choices seemed catastrophic on its own, but stacked together, all in the same afternoon, in the same space, they stripped away every layer of margin standing between the jaguar and an open corridor. The gate was forced. The animal moved into the space between the inner and outer fence lines. A second panel, also temporarily secured during the renovation, gave way under lateral pressure. Anita had separated briefly from her group and was jogging back toward the entrance along the outer path when the jaguar covered the distance between them. Witnesses reported almost no warning before the animal reached her. The sprint capacity of a jaguar over a short distance leaves no time for a person to react, regardless of where they're standing or how fast they can move. Emergency responders arrived quickly. It was already over by the time the first vehicle stopped. Federal inspectors arrived the following week and found what the investigation would describe as a pattern, not an incident. Multiple violations tied to temporary containment procedures during ongoing renovation. Duplicate safety systems being run sequentially rather than simultaneously. A decision environment in which renovation timelines and public programming had been allowed to overlap without clear protocols for which one took precedence when they conflicted. Anita Holt had done nothing that placed her in danger. She had separated briefly from a group at a zoo visit and was walking back along a path that was, on any other afternoon, fully secured. The danger that reached her had been constructed incrementally over several weeks of individually reasonable decisions made by adults who had no idea they were building toward the same moment. The zoo's permit was suspended. Its renovation was never completed. What makes this case particularly hard to sit with is that Anita did everything right. She followed instructions, stayed with her group, and was simply walking back along a path that should have been secured. The failure was entirely institutional, and a 17-year-old paid for it with her life. On the 9th of July 2016, the dry season had settled heavily across Limpopo province in northern South Africa. Grasslands turned yellow as dust followed vehicles through the bush, while shrinking waterholes forced wildlife closer to reserve roads. That morning, 42 years old, Theron Vosloo drove his family into a private game reserve several hours north of Johannesburg. Once they passed the entrance gate, the paved road disappeared behind them. The route narrowed into a rough dirt track surrounded by thorn trees and dry scrub. Mobile signal faded quickly until there was nothing left except wilderness. Theron was not new to places like this. For over a decade, the Pretoria wildlife photographer had captured elephants, giraffes, and predators across multiple reserves, growing so familiar with the bush that danger had begun to feel routine. His wife, Surette, sat beside him in the front passenger seat, while their 16-year-old daughter, Namsa, and 13-year-old son, Lwazi, rode quietly in the back. Like many families on safari, they spent most of the drive scanning the bush for movement, while Theron kept his camera resting near his lap, ready at any moment. Reserve rules required closed windows near predators. Vehicles acted as protection, and for hours, the lions they passed ignored the SUV entirely, as expected. The family spotted antelope grazing beneath trees and zebras farther down the road. Occasionally, Theron slowed to photograph through the closed glass. Everything felt calm and controlled. Then, late in the morning, they found the lions. A pride of 7 rested near the road. Theron photographed them from inside the SUV, but the closed windows created a problem he had dealt with before. Reflected sunlight softened details and ruined sharp wildlife shots. In previous reserves, he had briefly rolled his window down for cleaner images and nothing bad had happened. I think that's how dangerous habits usually develop. Nothing happens until one day, something does. So after several quiet minutes of watching the lions lie still, he lowered his window fully. At first, nothing changed. The lions lay calmly, briefly lifting their heads before settling again, and the atmosphere inside the SUV seemed to relax. But 2 of the younger females, near the outer edge of the pride, had already noticed the open window. One kept her gaze fixed on the gap beside Theron. The other, positioned slightly behind and further down the road, had gone very still in a way that was different from resting. Theron was still adjusting his camera settings when Surette suddenly grabbed his arm. The first lioness was already moving, not charging, not vocalizing, just closing the distance with calm, deliberate focus. The gap between her and the SUV disappeared frighteningly fast. Everything after that happened in seconds. She exploded upward at the open window with shocking speed, her head and upper body slamming against the side of the SUV with enough force to rock the entire vehicle. Her jaws locked onto the area between Theron's shoulder and neck, wrenching him violently against the window frame. Her claws hooked against the door panel for leverage. The camera flew from his hands and struck the dashboard. Surette screamed and grabbed at Theron's arm with both hands, while Lwazi dropped into the footwell behind them. Namsa lunged forward between the seats, trying to help. In the confusion, she grabbed the passenger side interior handle while reaching for the horn controls, accidentally pulling the latch. The passenger door swung open several inches. The second lioness had already circled to that side of the vehicle. She hit the door with her full weight, driving it wide before Surette could pull it shut. The sudden force threw Surette sideways against the open frame. She lost her footing against the seat, and her upper body swung outward through the gap. The lioness grabbed her immediately. Her jaws closed on Surette's upper chest and shoulder as her forepaws hooked against the door frame for leverage. Rather than forcing herself into the vehicle, the animal pulled using the same motion lions use to drag prey away from cover. Surette's body was wrenched further into the doorway, her torso now mostly outside the SUV, while her legs remained tangled against the seat. Namsa grabbed at her mother's legs and pulled back, screaming. The struggle in the doorway lasted only a few seconds, but the damage was already severe. Surette had sustained deep wounds to her neck and chest from the initial bite and the violent twisting force of the drag. On the driver's side, Theron was still fighting against the first lioness, blood spreading across his seat from deep wounds to his shoulder, neck, and the side of his face. His resistance was weakening. Namsa found the horn and pressed it down hard. The continuous blast cut through the chaos. The lioness on the passenger side released Surette and dropped back from the door. The animal on the driver's side released Theron and fell back onto the road. Both retreated several feet into the dirt. Namsa and Lawazi pulled Charette back inside the vehicle. She was breathing but unresponsive, bleeding heavily from her neck and chest. The Pride nearby remained mostly where they were, watching but not approaching. Namsa grabbed her father's reserve radio from the center console and broadcast for emergency assistance until a response confirmed help was coming. Theron had collapsed against the driver's seat. Lawazi was physically unharmed but remained pressed into the footwell, not moving. Rescuers arrived approximately 20 minutes after the alert and airlifted the family from the reserve. Theron and Charette both died from their injuries. Namsa was treated for deep lacerations across her arms and hands and survived. Lawazi was physically unhurt. The investigation found no operational fault with the reserve. Officials noted that both lions had behaved consistently with natural predatory behavior once the vehicle barrier was compromised on two sides simultaneously. The open driver's window created the first point of vulnerability. The accidentally unlatched passenger door created the second. It was May 18th, 2020, and the Northern Rockies were in the particular transition that defines Montana in mid-spring, the lower trails accessible again after the snowmelt had pulled back from the valley floors, the soil wet and soft underfoot from weeks of accumulated runoff, the brush already thick with new growth pressing close to the trail edges. The terrain gave the impression of manageable wilderness, the kind of landscape that registers as approachable until the specific conditions inside it reveal themselves at close range. Karen Smith was 49 years old. She worked in real estate and had built a personal reputation for treating a committed plan as something that existed outside the jurisdiction of inconvenient new information. A trip was a trip once it had been decided. That quality had served her well in professional environments where the cost of being wrong was recoverable. This was not one of those environments. The trait that makes someone good at closing deals is, in a very specific way, the trait that can get someone killed on a trail. Certainty is an asset until it isn't. She had arrived at the trailhead that morning as part of a plan she had already organized and was simply executing. Rangers had posted written notices and were communicating warnings verbally to arriving hikers. A grizzly bear had been sighted in the area multiple times during the previous week. This was not a general seasonal advisory. It was a targeted warning about a specific animal with a documented pattern of movement in a specific trail corridor during a specific and recent window. Karen received the warning directly. She assessed it and continued onto the trail alone. Listen, she already received a warning. Clear signs and a verbal caution about this recent sighting, but she simply ignored it. Just why would you do something so idiotic? That decision made in the parking lot, not on the trail, is the actual origin point of what followed. The bear did not make a decision that morning. Karen did. The trail moved through open terrain before narrowing between two ridge lines, the brush rising above head height and the path winding through it rather than offering clear sight lines ahead. In dense spring brush in the Northern Rockies, a 500-pound animal can be functionally invisible at 25 feet. The fact that you cannot see such a huge animal because of such conditions is unbelievable. Like, why even try to go when you can't even see anything? Humans are not built to face such animals and situations, so again, just why? Grizzly bears emerge from their dens between late March and early May, covering substantial ground along the same drainage corridors and lower elevation brush that hikers use. An average adult male weighs between 400 and 600 pounds and is capable of running at up to 35 miles per hour. In a close-range surprise encounter, the response is not predatory, it is defensive. The reflex is immediate and explosive. Karen rounded a bend and encountered the grizzly at a distance. Investigators later estimated at fewer than 20 feet. She turned to retreat. The rapid reversal of direction produced the same stimulus signature that fleeing prey produces. At 20 feet, the available distance was not a margin. By the time her body registered what was happening and began to respond, the response was already irrelevant. The bear closed the distance and made contact from behind. The first strike is delivered through the forepaw, sufficient to fracture the skull or drive a standing person directly to the ground. Karen went down. From the ground, the bear had complete mechanical advantage, its weight applied over her upper body, the claws raking across the neck and scalp, the bite applied to the back of the head and cervical spine. The attack was concentrated and severe, over in seconds. Karen Smith died on a trail she had been warned not to enter, by people standing at the entrance specifically to warn her. The warning was not vague, it was not general, it was about that trail, that week, that animal. She heard it and walked past it anyway.
It was October 9th, 2016. The reserve was in northern Botswana, vast, flat savanna broken up by acacia clusters and dry riverbeds. By October, the grass was low and yellow, and the animals were concentrated near the few remaining water sources. The tour had been running since 6 a.m. It was just past 9. Aldous Dubel was 47, a civil engineer from Portland, Oregon, traveling with his colleague Bet Sorrells, 44. They'd joined a small group safari, 4 tourists total plus a guide, booked through a local independent operator. Neither had been to sub-Saharan Africa before. They were seated in the second row of an open-air Land Cruiser. No roof, no roll cage. The trip had been Bet's idea. She'd been planning it for over a year. Aldous had agreed mostly because she'd asked him 3 times. African bush elephants are the largest land animals on Earth. Adult bulls average between 10,000 and 13,000 pounds and stand up to 13 feet at the shoulder. A charging elephant can hit 25 miles per hour, and their tusks can reach 6 feet, capable of puncturing vehicle frames. Bull elephants in musth, a hormonal state marked by elevated testosterone, are highly aggressive and don't need much of a reason to charge. The Quetzalcoatl is a dark, wet streak running down the side of the face from the temporal glands. If you see that on a lone bull, you leave. That's not a suggestion. The guide spotted a lone bull about 300 feet off the track and immediately clocked the temporal gland secretions. He called it out to the group and began reversing. No hesitation. The elephant turned to face the jeep, ears spread wide, head raised, a clear threat display. The guide kept reversing. Then Aldous leaned out over the side of the vehicle to get a better look, and Bet grabbed the roll bar and rose partially out of her seat. The guide told them both firmly to get down and stay down. Aldous pulled back slightly, but Bet stayed up, camera raised. The elephant pinned its ears and lowered its head. That's not a warning. That's the start of a charge. The bull covered the distance in under 5 seconds. The guide accelerated hard into the reverse, but the curved track killed his speed. There was no time. The right tusk connected with the front passenger side of the vehicle, punching through the hood and into the engine block. The impact spun the front of the Jeep hard to the left. The elephant drove forward into the second row, tusks and forehead directly into where Aldous and Beta were seated. The right side of the vehicle lifted off the ground. Aldous took the tusk on the right side of his chest and upper abdomen. Beta was thrown hard into the interior door frame as the vehicle twisted sideways under the elephant's weight. The side panel buckled inward. The guide was slammed against the steering column, and the 2 front-row tourists were thrown against the dash and side panels. The elephant pushed for about 8 seconds, then stepped back and stood over the vehicle before moving off slowly to the north. The guide, bruised but mobile, reached his radio and called for extraction. The nearest response team was about 35 minutes out. The 2 front-row tourists were shaken and banged up, but conscious. Aldous and Bet were both unresponsive inside the crushed second row. Both were pronounced dead at the scene. Aldous died from a penetrating tusk wound to the right thoracic cavity, entering between the 4th and 5th ribs, causing catastrophic damage to the right lung and surrounding vessels. Bet died from blunt force trauma to the head and cervical spine, consistent with high-impact collision against the vehicle's interior frame. Neither would have survived even with immediate surgical access. The guide had called the reversal the moment he spotted the musth bull. The post-incident review confirmed he followed protocol correctly. Bet was still partially standing when the elephant charged, and Aldous had leaned out seconds before. The movement in the second row is what locked that bull in. The deaths were ruled accidental. The guide's radio log, vehicle damage analysis, and witness accounts from the 2 surviving tourists were all recovered as evidence. It was May 6, 2014, and autumn chill had settled over the Southern Ocean as a cage diving vessel motored toward the Neptune Islands, a rocky archipelago roughly 40 miles south of Port Lincoln, South Australia. The islands hosted one of the region's largest colonies of long-nosed fur seals, and the concentration of prey drew great white sharks in numbers that made the site one of Australia's premier shark diving destinations. Several licensed operators ran trips from Port Lincoln during the autumn months when shark density peaked. Mulgrave's operation was consistently the cheapest. Niamh Calthorpe was a 31-year-old veterinary nurse from Edinburgh, Scotland, 7 months into an Australian working holiday. An experienced open-water diver with advanced certification and over 80 logged dives across Southeast Asia and the Great Barrier Reef, Calthorpe had specifically sought the Neptune Islands for what she considered the pinnacle encounter with great whites. She booked the afternoon session with Declan Mulgrave, a 39-year-old operator who ran a two-boat business out of Port Lincoln. Mulgrave had built a reputation for running back-to-back trips to maximize daily revenue, compressing turnaround time between sessions and deferring maintenance that would require taking a vessel out of rotation. The morning session had run late. During it, a deckhand noticed visible fraying along the steel cable connecting the cage to the winch system and flagged it to Mulgrave between trips. Mulgrave inspected it briefly and decided it would hold for one more session rather than canceling the afternoon and losing the revenue. The cage was negatively weighted with no independent flotation. A backup safety line had been rigged but was not load-rated. It would not arrest the descent if the primary cable parted. Calthorpe and one other diver entered the cage. A large male great white, estimated at 15 feet, began circling within minutes of deployment. That decision is the one I keep circling back to. The deckhand said the cable was fraying. The boss looked at it, looked at the afternoon bookings, and chose the revenue. Everything after traces back to that single calculation. Great whites near seal colonies operate in active predatory mode, unlike the investigatory behavior typically observed at chum-based operations. Their approaches are faster, more direct, and more aggressive. And adult male can weigh over 2,500 pounds and generate enormous force in short bursts. The shark made a high-speed pass against the cage, jarring the structure. The frayed cable, already compromised beyond its safe working load, gave way shortly after. Whether the shark's contact contributed or the cable simply reached its failure point was never determined. The cage was still at its shallow operating depth when the cable parted, and the non-load-rated backup line offered no resistance. The second diver exited through the top hatch in the first seconds of the drop, reaching the surface safely. Calthorpe's regulator hose became wrapped around a section of cage frame deformed inward by the shark's earlier strike, trapping her inside as the cage sank to roughly 25 meters and came to rest near the seafloor. Based on the recovered dive computer and scene reconstruction, Calthorpe's final minutes were chaotic. The cage had landed at an angle, and the interior was disoriented from its normal configuration. She struggled with the hose entanglement in near zero visibility, unable to locate the exit hatch on her first attempt. The stress and exertion burned through her remaining air at an accelerated rate. She eventually found the hatch, but by then her breathing gas was exhausted. She exited at depth and began ascending. She never reached the surface. That's the part that stays with me. No dramatic attack, no thrashing at the surface. She ran out of air alone in a cage that was never supposed to be there. The shark didn't kill her. The cable did. Emergency divers recovered Calthorpe's body later that afternoon. Cause of death was drowning. The investigation found the cable had been flagged for replacement that day, and Mulgrave had knowingly continued operations with compromised equipment. His operation was shut down permanently, and he faced criminal negligence charges. The backup safety line was examined and confirmed to be non-load rated, incapable of holding the cage's weight under any circumstances. The second diver, who had escaped during the initial seconds of the drop, provided testimony that formed a central part of the investigation.
It was June 8, 2014, and the winter light over northwest Namibia was turning the gravel plains gold by late afternoon. The communal conservancy land out there is famous for free-roaming, desert-adapted black rhino, one of the only places on Earth where a self-drive tourist can encounter one from a conservancy access road. The rental company handed over a laminated card of rules with the keys, and one line said to maintain substantial distance from rhino and back away if one ever appears agitated. Leonard and Annika Vosberg, 47 and 44, were a married couple from Hamburg on a 2-week self-drive holiday, and by day 9 the trip had been close to perfect. Elephants, giraffe, a pride of lions at a waterhole, all of it photographed from sensible distances like the careful people they had been the entire trip. They cooked at their campsites, and texted highlights to their 2 adult kids whenever a town gave them signal. The northwest leg was the part Leonard had planned the whole trip around, because the northwest meant a chance at black rhino. Late that afternoon, a black rhino appeared off the track maybe 80 yards ahead, browsing, a sighting people pay thousands of dollars for, and they had found it on their own. Annika remembered afterward that they both went completely silent, like talking might scare it off, and Leonard just lifted his foot off the brake and let the car creep. The rhino lifted its head, held still, then went back to browsing, so he eased forward again. People keep reading an animal's patience as permission. It tolerates the car at 80 yards, so they try it at 60. It tolerates it at 60, so they try it at 40. Nobody ever asks what happens at the yard where tolerance runs out. Each time the rhino accepted the car, the next stretch of track felt safer, and that is the exact same quiet trap that runs through every story in this episode. By the final stop, they were inside 30 yards with the engine idling, and the rhino's preferred route of movement appeared constrained, the vehicle sitting on one side and a dense stand of thorn bush walling off the other. Annika later told Conservancy officials that neither of them registered the geometry at the time. The bush was just scenery, and the car was just where the car had stopped. Black rhinos are one of the most reactive and unpredictable rhino species, with notoriously poor eyesight paired with acute hearing and smell. Anything unfamiliar at close range may trigger a defensive charge. Over short distances, they are faster than any reversing car, hitting speeds over 30 miles per hour from a standing start, and the species has a documented record of attacking vehicles outright: doors, fenders, and body panels. The rhino's head came up, ears rotating. It made 2 short, puffing snorts, a common sign of agitation, and Leonard, not recognizing what he was hearing, held position for the photo. Annika remembered asking if they should back up, and she remembered him saying, "1 second, just 1 second," and that was the whole conversation. The charge covered 30 yards in seconds. The horn and the full weight of the animal hit the driver's door, and the first impact crushed the driver's side inward, trapping Leonard against the steering wheel and door as the SUV was shunted sideways off the track. The sound, she said afterward, was the part she could not describe properly: metal folding and the animals breathing at the same time. It struck the panel again, compounding the injuries, and then Annika threw herself across the cabin and hammered the horn. And between the noise and the crumpling metal, the rhino finally turned, circled once, and crashed away through the thorn bush. Leonard had suffered catastrophic crush injuries to the chest. Annika was bruised but mobile, and she could not get a phone signal out there. So she drove that wrecked car for miles back toward the Conservancy gate, with the driver's side caved in around her husband, talking to him the entire way, even after he stopped answering. He was unresponsive on arrival, and authorities later confirmed he had succumbed to internal injuries before reaching medical care. The Conservancy logged the incident, and rangers noted the rhino had behaved consistently with documented defensive black rhino behavior. The animal was not pursued. Annika drove that caved car for miles through the dark with her husband dying in the seat next to her. No signal, no other vehicles, and I cannot imagine a longer drive existing anywhere on Earth. It was May 22nd, 2015, in western Pennsylvania. May in that part of the state is green and wet, the kind of green that comes from steady rain and wooded hillsides that hold moisture long after the sun returns. By evening, the air turns cool, carrying the smell of wet bark and pine. It's a good light for photography, but it's also the kind of evening where the canopy holds onto water, and when it finally releases it, it comes all at once. Nina Bailey was 31, a freelance wildlife photographer who had built her portfolio around captive exotic animals at independent zoos. She didn't want the photographs that already existed. She wanted the ones that weren't being taken, the quieter and more overlooked shots that required going somewhere smaller, less visible, more specific. She understood light and how to move within an enclosure without triggering a behavioral response. She preferred zoos that allowed proximity because she believed the images that came from that access were the only ones worth making. She had been granted approval for an evening photography session at a zoo on wooded property outside western Pennsylvania. The zoo housed several rescued African leopards, including a 140-pound adult male with a documented history of aggression toward handlers. Rain was forecast. The session was approved anyway. African leopards are the most adaptable of the large cats, and among the most dangerous, specifically because of how little they announce themselves. They climb. They position from above. They move through compressed spaces without detection. Unlike lions or tigers, which register in open ground, leopards reduce distance through elevation and patience, the kind of patience that looks like absence right up until it isn't. The adult male at this zoo had spent recent nights testing sections of the enclosure's upper mesh roofing. 2 locations had been compromised. The damage had been logged internally but not repaired, and it had not been reported to state regulators. And once again, we run into a detail that appears over and over in these stories. Somebody knew about the problem before it became a disaster. The rain arrived faster than forecast. Handlers were pulled toward moving feeding equipment across the exhibit, a redirect that focused their attention downward at the exact moment the threat was working from above. The added water weight on already compromised mesh caused a section of the upper roofing to collapse inward while handlers were mid-task and facing the wrong direction. When handlers discovered the collapsed section, they assessed the damage from the ground and concluded the animal had retreated into the service corridor within the enclosure's footprint still contained, just displaced. No lockdown was initiated. No visual confirmation was made. The leopard had already moved beyond the service corridor entirely into the elevated maintenance walkways running directly above the visitor path, and nobody on the ground knew it. Nina was photographing the feeding area near a staircase landing when the animal dropped from the overhead walkway into the corridor below. The distance from the walkway to the floor was short. The time between landing and contact was shorter. Staff could not reach her before it was over. The leopard was eventually contained in a locked storage section at the far end of the exhibit. Sadly, Nina succumbed to her injuries before any investigation team arrived tomorrow morning in the area. Authorities found the zoo operating without updated inspection approval. The mesh damage logged, unrepaired, and unreported was the central focus. But investigators noted something broader. The zoo had been operating outside the formal inspection cycle long enough that its internal records had become its only accountability system. Those records had flagged the problem, yet still allowed it to remain unresolved for weeks. And when the mesh finally gave way, the same informal culture that had allowed the damage to go unrepaired produced a ground assessment that was wrong and that nobody questioned before the session continued. On the 23rd of August 2013, the Calloway family drove deep into the mountains of northwestern Wyoming toward a remote backcountry trailhead, nearly 12 miles from the nearest paved highway. The remote Wyoming trailhead became silent at night as the family slept inside their locked SUV, believing it offered more protection than a tent, though they knew it wasn't foolproof. Merritt Calloway, 48, had spent most of his life in mountain terrain. He coached high school athletics in Montana, but outside work he hunted, hiked, and camped regularly. His family trusted his judgment outdoors because he was careful and organized. He carried bear spray within reach of the driver's seat and had already talked with his family about grizzly safety before the trip. That night, Merritt, his wife Sandra, and their 2 teenage children settled into the SUV after dark. The plan was simple: sleep at the trailhead, wake before sunrise, and begin hiking in the morning. The vehicle was locked. Their supplies were packed carefully in the cargo area. Food had been stored inside a hard cooler in the back of the SUV, something many outdoor travelers did routinely while sleeping in vehicles. At first, the night passed quietly. The family eventually fell asleep beneath the cold mountain air outside while the forest remained dark and still around the parking area. Sometime later, something changed. Sandra would later say she woke suddenly to a strange movement rocking the SUV. At first, she did not fully understand what she was feeling. The vehicle shifted slightly again, as if someone outside had pushed against it. Then came a scraping sound along the rear side panel. Merritt woke up almost immediately afterward. For several seconds, the family stayed completely still inside the dark vehicle, listening. Another heavy impact hit the SUV. This time the entire frame shook hard enough to rattle the windows. Outside, something large moved around the vehicle. I've always found persistent animal behavior more worrying than sudden aggression. Sandra later remembered hearing deep breathing and scratching sounds near the cargo area. The noise circled slowly around the SUV while claws scraped against metal near the rear wheel well. A grizzly bear had been working the vehicle before they woke, sniffing, circling, and testing the panels repeatedly. Investigators later reconstructed the timeline based on claw marks, dent depth, and disturbed soil patterns around the tires, evidence of sustained, persistent investigation rather than a brief passing encounter. Whatever had drawn the animal, it had not left. Inside the SUV, the family sat in near darkness, listening to the animal move around them. The vehicle rocked again. A teenager asked what was happening as Merritt strained to see through dark windows, with no lights outside, only shifting shadows. Then came another loud impact near the driver's side door. At some point during those moments, Merritt made a decision investigators could never fully explain. He reached for the driver's side handle. The exact reason was never confirmed. In similar cases, investigators note panic, misjudgment of distance, or attempts to deter the animal, but what Merritt believed in those seconds remained unknown. The moment he pushed the door open, the bear was positioned immediately outside it. The movement itself was likely enough: the sudden shift of air, the widening gap, the change in what the animal had been pressing against. The grizzly reacted without hesitation. A massive paw drove through the opening with enormous force before Merritt could pull the door back shut. The impact flung the door wide and threw Merritt sideways across the front seat. What followed happened in a matter of seconds. The bear struck at the open doorway, its head driving through the gap as Merritt tried to push back against it. The confined space offered almost no room to maneuver. He sustained severe injuries to his head and upper body within the first moments of contact, while the vehicle shook from the force of the animal against the frame. Sandra reached across the center console and found the horn. When it blared into the night, the sound cut sharply across the empty trailhead and through the surrounding trees. The horn caused the bear to hesitate and step back briefly from the door. It did not leave immediately. For a short time, it remained near the parking area, moving through the dark around the vehicle before eventually disappearing into the tree line south of the trailhead. Inside the SUV, the family was left in near darkness with Merritt critically injured in the driver's seat. An emergency call was placed from the trailhead, but help was far away. Forest Service responders required roughly 50 minutes to reach the remote location. Merritt Calloway died from his injuries before evacuation could be completed. Investigators concluded food inside the SUV likely drew the grizzly in, while opening the driver's door removed the one barrier that had kept the family protected through the night. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you liked today's video, go ahead and click that like button. Make sure you subscribe. We'll see you next time. It was June 3rd, 2015, and the forests of British Columbia's interior were deep into the long northern days of early summer. The mixed-use path Sharon Bennett had been hiking ran through dense, second-growth timber undergrowth heavy enough that the visual field closed off after a few yards, the path bending frequently so that what lay around any corner was not visible until you had already arrived at it. Sharon Bennett was 51 years old. She worked in sales and held a specific and documented relationship with unsolicited advice from people she didn't know, which people who knew her described uniformly as dismissive. In most domains, this produced minor frictions. I find myself thinking about the gap between a pattern that generates minor frictions in daily life and that same pattern activated on a wilderness trail. It's the same behavior. The consequences just scale completely differently depending on what the advice is about. Sharon was approximately 1.5 miles in when two cyclists came from the opposite direction, slowing to communicate with every person they passed. A black bear had been spotted on the trail ahead within the previous 20 minutes. They had observed the animal directly, reversed direction because of it, and were relaying specific first-hand information to everyone moving toward it. These weren't people being cautious. These were people who had seen the bear, turned around because of it, and were now telling everyone exactly what they had seen. Several hikers in Sharon's immediate vicinity reversed direction, Sharon continued. Her assessment was that the warning was overstated, that the cyclists had read the situation as more dangerous than it was. The certainty it takes to hear a first-hand account from someone who just saw the animal and reversed course, and to decide you know better than them about what they experienced. That's a very specific kind of confidence, and it was wrong in a very specific and irreversible way. Sharon reached the flagged section of trail. The bear was near the vegetation at the trail's edge, partially inside the brush line, visible from the path at roughly 15 feet. Sharon stopped and held her position. Holding position at 15 feet from a black bear in dense vegetation is not a neutral act. The bear is registering the continued presence through scent and sound, and a stationary human at that range who is not retreating is processed as a presence that is not resolving. The bear began displaying clear agitation, weight shifting, vocalizing, orienting directly toward Sharon's position. Sharon remained in position. The bear lunged from the brush edge. The distance between the tree line and the trail was not enough for the charge to develop into a sustained run. The bear covered the gap in a single explosive movement, already committed before Sharon could process the transition from warning behavior to contact. The bear struck her with its forepaws, driving her backward and off her feet. From the ground, the attack continued the bear, applying its jaw to her upper body and arms, raking with the forepaws across her back and shoulders. The injuries were severe and concentrated in the upper body and neck. Sharon Bennett died from injuries sustained in the attack. The cyclists who warned her were right. The hikers who turned around were right. All of that correct information was available to Sharon before she reached the animal, and none of it reached her in a form she was willing to receive.
It was May 18th, 2015. The concession was in western Tanzania, open thornbush country with low hills, scattered acacia, and dry red soil that turned to dust under your boots. Visibility was decent in most directions, maybe 80 to 100 feet, before the brush thickened. The group had been on foot for about 2 hours. It was just past 7 a.m., still cool, the kind of morning that makes you feel like nothing out here could go wrong. Harlan Drell was 55, a retired insurance broker from Nashville, Tennessee. He'd done one previous walking safari in South Africa 4 years earlier and considered himself experienced enough to know the basics. He was traveling with his adult son, River, 27, and 4 other tourists as part of a small group walking tour led by a single armed guide. Harlan was the most vocal in the group, always at the front, always asking questions, always a half step ahead of where the guide wanted him. The guide had already redirected him twice that morning. Reminded me of that one guy in every group tour who thinks the rules are more of a suggestion. Cape buffalo are among the most dangerous animals on the continent. Adult bulls weigh between 1,100 and 1,800 pounds and stand up to 5.5 feet at the shoulder. Their fused horn boss, the thick plate of bone across the top of the skull, makes a frontal charge almost impossible to stop with anything short of a high-caliber rifle. They don't bluff charge the way elephants do. When a buffalo commits, it follows through. Lone bulls are considered the most dangerous. Older, often carrying old injuries, and with very little tolerance for anything that gets too close. The guide spotted a lone bull standing in a patch of shade about 110 feet to the right of the trail. He stopped the group and signaled everyone to hold position and move left to increase distance. Harlan didn't move left. He took 2 steps forward instead, camera up. The guide signaled him back firmly. Harlan took 1 more step. The buffalo's head dropped. And just so we're clear, a dropped head on a Cape buffalo is not a warning. That's already the charge. The bull covered 110 feet in roughly 4 seconds. The guide couldn't fire. Harlan was directly in the line of sight. The right horn connected with Harlan's left side at hip level, driving upward and lifting him off the ground before throwing him about 8 feet to the right. The buffalo didn't stop. It turned and found River, who had stepped forward when he saw his father go down. The second impact caught River across the lower back and right hip, driving him face first into the ground. The buffalo stood over him briefly before the guide fired a warning shot into the dirt. The animal flinched, turned, and moved off into the brush at a trot. Start to finish, under 20 seconds. Harlan wasn't moving. River was conscious but couldn't get up. The guide radioed for extraction immediately. The group was about 3.5 miles from the nearest vehicle access point. A vehicle reached them in about 28 minutes. Harlan was unresponsive the entire time. River was alert, but couldn't bear weight on his right side. Harlan Drell was pronounced dead upon arrival at a medical facility. The horn impact ruptured his spleen and liver and fractured his left pelvis and 3 lower ribs. Internal hemorrhage was the cause of death. With a 28-minute extraction and no surgical access in the field, survival wasn't possible regardless of what anyone did after the fact. River survived, fractured right hip, 2 fractured lumbar vertebrae, and deep soft tissue bruising across the lower back. He had surgery and recovered over several months. The guide's post-incident report documented Harlan's repeated failure to follow instructions, including the 2 redirections earlier that morning. Every other tourist in the group backed it up. The guide's decision not to fire during the charge was reviewed and confirmed as the correct call. Harlan was in the line of fire the entire time. Death ruled accidental. The guide was cleared. GPS tracking data, the guide's radio log, and the written incident report filed the same day were all recovered as evidence. It was March 30th, 2013, and a light trade wind ruffled the Pacific off Oahu's windward coast. The morning was clear and warm, the water calm, and the conditions near perfect for paddling. And a group of 8 kayakers paddled single file over a shallow reef shelf where sea turtles, rays, and reef fish were visible through the transparent hulls of their vessels. The Clear Kayak Eco Tour had operated along this stretch of coastline for 4 seasons, offering tourists a unique perspective on Hawaii's marine ecosystem from see-through polycarbonate boats that allowed them to watch the ocean floor pass directly beneath their feet. Sloan Driscoll was a 36-year-old travel photographer from Portland, Oregon, visiting Oahu specifically for ocean photography content. The Clear Kayak Tour had appeared on her shot list after she saw promotional images of marine life beneath the transparent hulls. Her portfolio relied on distinctive underwater perspectives that set her work apart, and the transparent kayak offered angles she couldn't get from a boat or the shoreline. The tour was operated by Keone Palakiko, a 48-year-old Hawaiian who had grown up along the windward coast and built the kayak business over 4 years. The route followed the reef shelf, but passed near a channel where the bottom dropped off sharply, a known transit corridor for tiger sharks moving between feeding grounds along the coast. Palakiko briefed the group before launch. Stay on the reef side, do not paddle past the marker buoy near the channel, stay with the group at all times. Driscoll fell behind within 20 minutes, deliberately slowing her pace to photograph the reef below without other kayakers cluttering her frame. She drifted past the marker buoy toward the channel, where bright turquoise shifted to dark blue beneath her hull. A large shadow moved below the kayak. Rather than retreating toward the group, she began photographing it. I'll never fully understand that instinct. Seeing a large predator appear directly beneath you and reaching for the camera instead of the paddle. But I've read enough of these stories to know it happens again and again. The lens becomes a barrier that feels like protection, even when it isn't. Tiger sharks are the most dangerous shark species in Hawaiian waters, responsible for the majority of fatal attacks in the islands. Adults commonly reach 14 feet and 1,400 pounds. They investigate unfamiliar objects from below. Surfboards, kayaks, and paddleboards all present silhouettes that trigger this behavior. The shark had been circling beneath her kayak for nearly a minute, making repeated passes as she photographed it. On one pass, it rose and bumped the underside of the hull. Driscoll had been leaning to one side, adjusting her camera angle. The bump startled her. The combination of her shifted weight, the upward force, a passing swell, and her sudden movement tipped the lightweight vessel into the water above the channel edge. The kayak overturned completely, cosmetic scratching marking the hull, but structurally intact. Driscoll surfaced and attempted to right the kayak, but the overturned vessel was difficult to manage alone under panic. It rolled under her weight each time, the smooth polycarbonate offering no grip, keeping her treading water above the drop-off. The group was roughly 50 yards away, on the reef side of the buoy. Palakiko had noticed her absence and was paddling back toward the channel. According to the other kayakers who witnessed the event from distance, the shark dropped out of sight beneath the surface after the capsize. Driscoll struggled with the overturned kayak for an estimated 10 to 20 seconds, kicking and splashing visible from distance. What happened below the surface during those seconds was not observed. Whether the shark circled, repositioned, or simply reacted to the disturbance above was unknown. It struck from below and behind her, from an angle she never saw, delivering a single bite to her lower body. The serrated teeth opened deep lacerations across her thigh, severing major blood vessels. Driscoll surfaced after the bite and attempted to swim toward the reef, but her injured leg wouldn't respond. She stayed at the surface for several seconds, weakening visibly as blood clouded the water. She slipped below and did not resurface. The cause of death was later determined as blood loss and drowning. 50 yards. That's how close the nearest kayaker was when it happened. Close enough to watch, not close enough to help. That distance is the detail from this story I don't think I'll forget. Palakiko paddled to the area immediately, but found only the capsized kayak and a widening blood trail in the water. Coast Guard divers recovered remains the following day. The investigation found Driscoll had drifted beyond the designated boundary into a known shark corridor. Palakiko was not found liable, but the tour route was permanently altered to increase distance from the channel. The incident intensified scrutiny of ocean-based tourism operations across the state.
It was April 26, 2016, and peak dry season had the tiger reserves of central India delivering the best sightings of the year. Water was scarce, the cats were predictable, and every morning the open-sided gypsies rolled through the gates packed with tourists. A tigress, with cubs, had been holding territory near a waterhole for weeks, and every driver and naturalist working that zone knew exactly where she was likely to be. Siddesh Wagolikar was a 29-year-old investment analyst from Mumbai, on the drive with 5 other tourists and a naturalist. He had been chasing one specific thing the entire trip, a tiger photo good enough to post, and he had spent 3 drives complaining that every sighting was too far away for his phone. The others in the gypsy had proper cameras with long lenses, and every time they reviewed their shots at breakfast, his phone photos looked worse by comparison. The rule in every Indian reserve is the same, and the naturalist had repeated it that morning before the gate even opened. Stay seated. Stay inside the vehicle outline, because tigers read the gypsy as one solid object, and a human silhouette breaking that outline changes everything. The sighting happened fast. The tigress stepped out of the bamboo and crossed the track roughly 10 to 15 feet ahead of the stopped vehicle, and one cub emerged from the bamboo behind her moments later. Every camera in the gypsy was up, the only sounds shudders and breathing. Wagholikar was already standing on his seat, and as she passed in front of the gypsy, he leaned far out over the doorframe, head and shoulders fully outside the vehicle's shape, stretching his phone out directly above her for the top-down shot. The naturalist grabbed at his shirt, hissing at him to sit down. What do you think a phone photo is actually worth? Because I have scrolled past 10,000 tiger pictures in my life, and I could not describe a single one of them to you right now. Bengal tigers are the largest big cats in Asia, with females weighing between 220 to 350 pounds. And they tolerate safari vehicles only as long as the vehicle reads as a single solid object. A human shape suddenly breaking that outline at close range, directly overhead, with a cub present, removes every condition, keeping the situation calm. Inside 15 feet, a tiger's strike arrives faster than a person can flinch. The tigress reacted to the shape and the object suddenly hanging above her. Investigators later believed it was a defensive response at extreme close range, with a cub present. She leapt upward and her jaws caught high across the shoulder and the side of the neck, and losing his balance under the impact, he was pulled from the vehicle onto the track. She held the grip for several seconds before releasing under the barrage of horns and shouting. The other passengers said afterward that the speed was the thing nobody's brain could process. One instant she was walking past, and the next he simply was not in the vehicle anymore. The driver gunned the engine and laid on the horn while the naturalist and the other passengers shouted, and she moved into the bamboo toward the cub. It had already been enough. The forensic examination found severe neck and upper body trauma, rapidly fatal according to investigators. His phone was recovered from the track afterward, and the footage shows the lean and then cuts out the moment the vehicle lurched, so the one photo he climbed out of a vehicle's outline to get does not even exist. Park authorities documented the conduct violation, and the tigress was not declared a problem animal and was not destroyed. The response classified as defensive, and the cause classified as visitor behavior. The reserve issued a conduct circular to every operator in the zone about standing and leaning during close sightings, and several operators began briefing guests with this specific incident as the example. It was June 18th, 2016, rural Oklahoma. The flatlands in June carry a flat, patient heat, nothing dramatic, just steady pressure from every direction. The air stays still. By midday, there is no shade worth finding. Jose Velas was 29, and he was the kind of person who knew just enough about a subject to feel completely comfortable around it. He had kept reptiles since his early teens. Nothing professionally, nothing that would place him in any formal category of handler or expert, but he had spent enough years around enough animals that he had stopped experiencing the baseline caution most people carry around large predators. And personally, I think that's one of the most dangerous stages a person can reach around any animal. Fear can get you hurt, but familiarity can convince you nothing bad is going to happen at all. He attended exotic animal expos across the southern United States the way other people attend trade shows or weekend parties, enthusiastically, regularly, and with the quiet confidence of someone who had been close to dangerous things before and walked away each time without incident. He had booked a visitor tour at a reptile zoo outside rural Oklahoma that offered guided walkthrough presentations of large captive reptiles. It was exactly the kind of destination he sought out. The zoo's primary exhibit was a 14-foot saltwater crocodile weighing just over 900 pounds. Saltwater crocodiles are the largest living reptile species on Earth and among the most mechanically dangerous animals in captivity. Their bite force exceeds 3,700 pounds per square inches, the highest recorded of any living animal, and their attack mechanism is not a sustained hold but a rapid, explosive strike, followed by a rotational roll designed to disorient and disable prey within the first seconds of contact. They do not telegraph. They do not escalate. The transition from still to attacking is essentially instantaneous. The zoo had documented a problem with the crocodile's primary enclosure gate for weeks before Jose arrived, a drainage side barrier that had been weakened by soil erosion along its lower frame. The repair had been scheduled. The parts had been ordered. I never find those details reassuring when I read investigation reports. A dangerous problem doesn't become less dangerous because someone filled out the paperwork to fix it later. Nobody saw it coming because nobody was watching for it. The crocodile hadn't lunged. It hadn't thrashed. It had simply kept pressing short, patient intervals of lateral force against the lower frame. The kind of movement that doesn't look like escape until the moment it becomes exactly that. When the barrier gave, it gave all at once. No warning, no sound that anyone would have recognized as a sound worth running from. The crocodile entered the public walkway in a single motion. 8 visitors were standing in that corridor, positioned for the guided presentation, close enough to each other that there was nowhere obvious to move. Jose was among them. Nobody there was aware of this, but staff at the far end saw the barrier fail and started moving immediately without hesitation, just moving, as if they had sensed something in their minds. The distance between them and the visitors wasn't large. On any other morning, it wouldn't have mattered at all, but that morning, it was the only thing that did. Jose was closest to the enclosure side of the corridor. The animal covered the distance between the gate and his position in a movement that witnesses described as faster than they had expected, and lower to the ground than anything that size should have been able to move. The attack was over before staff reached the corridor. Other visitors sustained injuries during the evacuation. Unfortunately, Jose did not survive the initial contact. Investigators found the zoo operating with a maintenance backlog across multiple enclosures. The drainage side barrier specifically noted in internal records as a priority repair 11 days before the incident. The parts that had been ordered had not yet arrived. The tour had not been suspended while the barrier remained unresolved. There was no protocol requiring it to be. Jose Velez had visited that zoo as a paying guest who understood reptiles well enough to be excited by proximity to a large one, and not well enough to know what an unsecured barrier beside a 900-pound saltwater crocodile actually meant. That gap between familiarity and knowledge, between comfort and safety, was where the morning sequence of failures found him. It was September 12, 2017, and Wyoming's high country was in the narrow window between late summer and mountain autumn. The aspens had begun turning, and the landscape above the tree line was clear in every direction, the kind of fall day in the Rockies that produces excellent visibility and a particular quality of false confidence that comes from being able to see everything and misunderstanding what seeing everything means. Patricia Doyle was 57 years old. She had hiked extensively and built a personal operating philosophy around the premise that fearlessness communicated clearly and physically produced better outcomes than retreat. That record had accumulated enough confirmations that it had become, in her outdoor approach, close to universal. The problem with a framework never tested against the right counter evidence is that it doesn't know where its own limits are, and sometimes the test that finds those limits is fatal. The group came around a bend and found a grizzly bear approximately 40 yards ahead, in the trail, partially turned toward the approaching figures. 40 yards in open terrain is a meaningful distance, enough space for a slow lateral retreat, enough time for the bear to assess the group as non-threatening. The other hikers began backing away slowly together. That was the correct read. That was the exit the situation was offering. Patricia stopped, turned toward the bear, raised her walking stick, and began advancing while vocalizing. Shouting at the animal, waving the stick, moving toward it with the intent to drive it off the trail. Noise-making and large body positioning have utility in certain bear encounters. An already alert grizzly, at 40 yards on an open trail, receiving an approaching and vocalizing human, is not one of those contexts. What Patricia communicated to that bear was not dominance, it escalated. And a grizzly receiving escalation at 40 yards does not pause to reconsider. The grizzly charged. A grizzly covering 30 to 35 yards at full full speed, does so in approximately 2.5 to 3 seconds. Patricia had no mechanism available that would have produced a different physical result once the charge began. The rest of the group, who had retreated, were far enough back that the bear's attention did not extend to them. Patricia had, in a very literal sense, selected herself out of the group by being the one moving toward the animal while everyone else moved away. The bear struck her at full running speed. 400 to 600 pounds at 30 miles per hour delivered through the forepaws drove her to the ground. Biting force was applied to the back of the neck and upper spine while the forepaws raked across the scalp and shoulders. The attack was over in seconds. Patricia Doyle died on a trail that the rest of her group walked away from because the rest of her group made a different decision at the moment that mattered. Reminder for you or anyone watching, never ever try to get the attention of a wild animal, especially if that animal can easily end your life in the blink of an eye.
It was July 22nd, 2017. The reserve was in the lowlands of southern Zimbabwe, flat, dry country broken up by scattered brush and a wide lake running through the center of the property. The water was brown and completely opaque, the kind that swallows everything beneath the surface without a trace. The reserve ran small group boat tours twice a day, and by mid-morning the air was already sitting at 91 degrees Fahrenheit. The hippos had been in the water since before dawn. Gary Toln was 52, a retired logistics manager from Denver. He'd saved for this trip for 3 years, first time in Africa, planned every detail himself. He was traveling with a small group of 6 other tourists, all strangers, booked through the same independent operator. Gary had specifically requested a front seat on the pontoon for the best view. That detail matters later. Hippos are the 3rd largest land animal on Earth. Adult males average between 3,300 and 4,000 pounds and can reach up to 19 miles per hour on land. Their canine teeth grow up to 20 inches, and their bite force is estimated at over 1,800 pounds per square inch. They're responsible for more human fatalities in Africa than any other large land animal, and they are fiercely territorial in water. They don't give a lot of warning, and that's the part people consistently underestimate. The guide spotted a pod of 4 hippos about 200 feet ahead and cut the engine. He told the group to stay seated and keep their hands inside the boat. One of the 4 submerged. Gary, sitting at the front, leaned over the rail trying to see where it went. The guide told him to sit back. Gary pulled back briefly, then leaned out even further. Told him a second time. Gary didn't move. I'm not sure what he thought he was going to see. The water was completely brown. The hippo surfaced alongside the front left float. A 3,800-pound animal rising at speed, lifted and tilted the front corner of the pontoon. The boat pitched hard to the left, and 3 tourists went in, Gary included. The guide and 2 others grabbed the center rail and held on. Gary was face down in the water. The other 2 were screaming and swimming toward the boat, and the guide pulled them aboard. Gary didn't move. The hippo resurfaced about 15 feet away, held its position briefly, then moved off toward the far bank. The guide reached Gary with a pole and pulled him alongside the boat. He was breathing shallowly and completely unresponsive. Lifting him aboard a pontoon without a swim platform and with an unbalanced passenger load wasn't safe, so the guide looped a rope under Gary's arms, secured him to the side, radioed the base station, and started moving toward shore at low speed. A response team reached them at the shoreline about 22 minutes later. Gary couldn't be revived. Gary Toln was pronounced dead shortly after reaching shore. Primary cause of death was drowning, with blunt crush trauma to the thoracic cavity as a contributing factor. The hippo's bite had fractured 6 ribs on his left side, 2 displaced inward and punctured his left lung. He had been unconscious and face down in the water before the guide secured him, and water aspiration had begun before he was pulled alongside the boat. Either injury alone would have required immediate surgical intervention to survive. Out on that lake, he had no chance. The guide followed protocol throughout. Correct distance, clear warnings, proper response after the attack. The post-incident review found no violations on his part. Gary had been told twice to sit back and didn't, and his weight shifting at the front of the boat put him directly over the water when the hippo surfaced. The death was ruled accidental. The guide's radio log, GPS tracking data, and witness statements from the 5 surviving tourists were all recovered as evidence. It was November 8th, 2015, and the dry season sun hung overhead as a flat-hulled tour boat motored across a shallow reef shelf off a small island in Fiji's Mamanuca chain. The glass-bottom operation had run daily excursions here for over a decade, with crew routinely tossing bread scraps overboard to attract reef fish beneath the panels. The practice also drew larger predators to the area over time. Darian Ashgrove was a 44-year-old real estate agent from Brisbane, Australia, on holiday with a group of friends celebrating a milestone birthday. Her companions would later describe her as someone who dismissed instructions she found excessive. The boat was operated by Kavani Tuasis, a 52-year-old Fijian captain with 20 years on these waters. The low-sided vessel carried 3 large laminated glass panels set into the floor, installed 8 years earlier without replacement despite a manufacturer recommendation for every 5 years. Weeks prior, a crew member had dropped an anchor chain onto the center panel, leaving a stress fracture that was noted in the maintenance log but never repaired. What stays with me is how ordinary the failure was. Not a dramatic collapse. Just a crack someone wrote off and a replacement someone postponed. That's the kind of negligence that doesn't look like negligence until it's too late. Tuasis briefed passengers before departure. They were to remain seated on the side benches at all times. Kneeling on the glass panels was prohibited. Approximately 40 minutes into the excursion, with the boat anchored over a section of reef shelf where reef sharks and rays were visible below, Ashgrove moved off her bench and knelt directly on the center panel to photograph a small reef shark passing beneath. Tuasis instructed her to return to her seat. She waved him off without looking up. He repeated the instruction more firmly. She continued adjusting her camera angle. A second friend joined her on the panel. Tuasis moved toward them. Before he reached them, a large shadow passed beneath the boat. An 11-foot tiger shark was cruising the reef edge near deeper water. Tiger sharks rank as the second most dangerous shark species to humans. Adults commonly exceed 14 feet and 1,400 pounds. Their serrated teeth are designed for shearing through turtle shells, bone, and cartilage. They frequently patrol reef edges in tropical waters, and investigatory bumps against boats and hulls are well-documented behavior. The fractured panel had been near failure for weeks. Under the concentrated weight of 2 women kneeling on it, the existing crack gave way without warning. The laminated layers delaminated along the fracture line, and the center of the panel sagged sharply inward. The glass didn't shatter completely, but the sudden structural give underfoot sent both women scrambling. Ashgrove's friend threw herself sideways onto the bench. Ashgrove, off balance and closer to the low gunwale, overcorrected and pitched over the edge into the water. She surfaced alongside the hull, disoriented and splashing in water still clouded from the morning's fish feeding. For roughly 10 seconds, she struggled to orient herself, her panicked splashing in the scent-laden water drawing the tiger shark's attention. The shark passed beneath her, then turned and delivered a single investigatory bite to her thigh and hip. The serrated teeth opened deep lacerations through muscle and tissue, severing major blood vessels. The shark released and circled away. The crew scrambled to reach her but was simultaneously managing water ingress through the damaged panel and stabilizing panicking passengers. That sequence is what I find cruel about this one. She didn't jump in. She didn't fall through the glass. A crack nobody fixed pitched her over the side, and by the time she hit the water, the shark was already beneath her. Ashgrove was pulled from the water, but had lost catastrophic amounts of blood. She was pronounced dead before reaching shore. The investigation determined the primary cause was structural failure of a panel that had not been repaired or replaced within guidelines. The victim had been kneeling on it against direct instruction. The operation was suspended, and the owner cited for maintenance violations.
It was July 11, 2015, and the dry season had the Zambezi River pulled back to its winter channels, with hippos crowding every remaining pool. The Riverside Lodge printed its one serious rule on every room card and repeated it at check-in. No walking the grounds after sundown without a staff escort. The escorts were free. They came on a radio call in under a minute, and the reason was grazing hippos, because at dusk, they leave the water and spread across the lawn's feed. Guests watched them from the deck every evening, huge dark shapes mowing the grass in the floodlights, and the distance made the whole thing feel like part of the show. Meredith Sabo was a 52-year-old real estate agent agent from Vancouver, Canada, on the last evening of a week-long stay. She had photographed the sunset from the lodge deck every single night, and on the final one she wanted something better. The shot from the actual waterline with the sun dropping behind the far bank. All week, she had used the escorts without complaint. Friendly staff with flashlights walking her between her room and the bar after dark. And all week, the lawns had looked exactly the same. Empty, mowed, harmless. The escort felt like overkill for a 100-yard walk she could see the whole way down. The escort was free. The lodge had staff on radios who would walk you anywhere in under a minute. And I still cannot wrap my head around skipping that because the path was short and the lawn looked empty. She took the river path as the light went orange. A hippo was already out of the water, grazing the bank grass between the path and the lodge buildings, and in the fading light she walked past it without ever seeing it. Hippos at dusk are weirdly easy to miss, a dark shape low against dark grass, completely silent while they feed, nothing like the loud splashing animals everyone watches from the deck at midday. By the time she reached the waterline and raised her camera, the animal was behind her, and she was standing on the one strip of ground no person should ever occupy, directly between a grazing hippo and the river. Hippos are widely regarded as one of Africa's most dangerous large animals. They are not hunters, they are territorial and explosively defensive, and the water is where they spend most daylight hours and where alarmed animals generally attempt to return. At dusk, they graze on land, and anything that ends up between a hippo and its escape route to the water is in the most dangerous position the continent offers. Over short distances, a hippo outruns any human, and their bite delivers crushing force across a gape wide enough to span a person. Her movement at the waterline startled it. The charge came from behind, and the evidence suggested she likely never saw it coming. Her camera was recovered in the grass, with the lens cap off and the sunset still on the screen. Investigators believe the hippo struck and bit her as it forced its way past her toward the river, and then it was simply gone into the dark water because she had never been its target, just the obstacle on its path home. An escort walking another guest down the same path found her minutes later. The internal injuries were catastrophic, and she died at the scene before any evacuation was possible, the nearest hospital hours away by road. The lodge's escort policy and signage were documented, and no liability was found. The rule had been printed on her own room card the entire week. The staff changed one thing on their own after that night. They began sweeping the river path at sundown every single evening, whether or not anyone had booked an escort. It was September 3rd, 2017, on the coast of Louisiana. September on the Gulf Coast carries the tail end of hurricane season, the air thick with moisture. The ground still soft from summer flooding that never fully drains. The zoos and swamp properties scattered along the inland coast have a particular stillness in the early morning. For Jacob White, an obscure zoo in coastal Louisiana was exactly the kind of stop that made the trip worth taking. He was 42, a substitute teacher from Arkansas, and the road trips were his thing. School breaks meant loading up the car with his 15-year-old son and driving toward places that didn't show up in travel guides, a little unusual. A little isolated, cheap admission, thin crowds. The zoo outside coastal Louisiana was exactly his kind of stop. Small, quiet, and run with the informal ease of a place that had never needed to present itself as anything more than what it was. The zoo housed confiscated exotic mammals. The largest animal on the property was a 3,200-pound male hippopotamus, imported years earlier from a foreign breeding program. Hippopotamuses are among the most dangerous large mammals on Earth, not because they hunt, but because their territorial responses are explosive and non-negotiable. A fully grown male can accelerate to over 20 miles per hour across short ground, with a bite force exceeding 2,000 psi sufficient to sever a small vessel in a single movement. Staff had noted the animal's elevated agitation in the days before Jacob's visit, tied to flooding that had disrupted its enclosure routine. Days of severe rain had worked steadily on a steel maintenance gate connected to the hippo's holding canal. Incremental structural damage that doesn't look critical at any single point until the load exceeds what remains of its rated capacity. The animal forced through during an overnight storm and positioned itself somewhere on the zoo grounds before dawn. When morning came, only 2 employees arrived. Storm damage had eliminated the rest of the scheduled crew, and no replacements had been called in. Radio communication between sections of the property was down. One of the 2 reported spotting what he believed was the hippo near the canal from across the grounds. With no way to cross-check, no radio, and an entire property to manage between 2 people, that distant, unverified sighting became the basis for the decision. No physical sweep. No delay to opening, no confirmation of any kind. Visitors, including Jacob and his son, were admitted on schedule. And I have to say, I don't understand that decision. If you're not sure where a 3,200-pound hippo is, then the answer isn't to open the gates anyway. The hippo entered the outdoor concession area mid-morning. Initial crashing sounds were attributed to storm debris still settling. It bought the animal seconds before anyone registered what was moving. Then wooden barriers and picnic tables gave way almost instantly as visitors scattered across the grounds. Jacob sustained severe injuries during the animal's movement through the space. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but sadly, neither fact changed the outcome. Investigators didn't have to work to find the failure point. It was documented in the zoo's own morning logs. A breach identified, a two-person crew with no radio contact, a single unverified sighting treated as confirmation. Maintenance repairs flagged months before the flooding were still outstanding. The gate had been on the list. The decisions that cost him his life were made before he ever arrived in maintenance records, budget meetings, and a skeleton crew sent in without the tools to do the job safely. It was August 22nd, 2018, and the Alaskan backcountry was in the compressed peak of a northern summer. The days long, the tundra meadows open and wide. The group had been transported to the observation area by a guiding operation whose staff had worked this specific terrain across multiple seasons. They knew the meadow's layout, the wind behavior along the ridge, and the behavioral patterns of the grizzlies that used this area during the late summer feeding period. The 150-yard viewing boundary they had established was not a default setting. It was the product of direct operational experience with the specific animal they were observing. Carol Hastings was 55 years old. She documented travel and had built her professional output around the premise that compelling content required pushing past the comfortable margin, moving beyond where the person next to you stopped. On this tundra meadow, that framework was being applied to a grizzly bear that the guides knew personally, had observed repeatedly at various distances, and had identified the exact point where its tolerance ended. That information existed nowhere except in the experience of the guides. Carol had access to it only through their instructions. She discarded those instructions almost immediately. The bear entered the meadow during the early morning feeding window, visible from the group's position at just under 150 yards. The guides communicated the viewing boundary before the animal appeared and reiterated it when the bear came into view. Carol began moving past the boundary. One of the guides moved quickly in her direction and told her to return. She continued past him too. At approximately 80 yards, the bear raised its head and oriented toward Carol's position. At 60 yards, it rose onto its hind legs. At 50 yards, it dropped back to all fours and charged. A grizzly covering 50 yards of open tundra at full speed reaches that distance in under 4 seconds. Carol had registered the bear's posture shift and was moving away, but a human moving on foot across open tundra does not change what 4 seconds means at that closing rate. The guides were too far to physically intercept what was happening. The bear struck Carol in the open meadow. Several hundred pounds of mass at running speed drove her to the ground immediately. Biting force was applied to the head and upper neck. The forepaws raked across the back of the scalp and shoulders. The open ground gave the bear no environmental reason to disengage quickly, and the attack ran until the physical signals it was responding to had been eliminated. Carol Hastings died in a section of meadow she had been specifically, directly, and repeatedly instructed not to enter by the people she had paid a guiding fee specifically to be directed by. That's the part I can't get past. Not the charge, not the contact, but the fact that she had purchased the expertise that would have kept her alive, and then immediately discarded it the moment it became inconvenient.
It was September 14th, 2015. About 4 miles off the Baja California coast, the water goes from postcard turquoise to deep green, almost black the further out you get. No landmarks, just open ocean and a thin brown strip on the horizon. That's where this tour was running. No company name, no uniforms, just a laminated flyer at a hostel front desk and a local guy with a 22-foot fiberglass hull. Tavio Huel was 34, a warehouse shift supervisor from Tucson, Tucson. He'd booked the trip as a birthday surprise for his girlfriend, Maris Ostler, 31. Their friends Weston and Lori Dre came along, 38 and 36. None of them had real open ocean experience. No cage, no wetsuit, just a glass viewing panel in the floor and whatever swam underneath it. The one thing Tavio didn't mention to the guide, neither he nor Maris could swim. Not well, anyway. September is peak great white season along the Baja coast. Great whites here run around 15 feet. The glass panel in the floor was decorative, not rated for structural load or impact. That detail wasn't in the flyer. Early in the tour, the guide threw fish scraps overboard to pull marine life toward the glass, leaving a scent trail in peak season. About 20 minutes in, a large dorsal fin appeared roughly 80 feet out. The guide cut the engine but didn't turn back. A dark shape passed beneath the glass. Nobody seemed alarmed. Then the fin went under and didn't come back up. 4 minutes of flat, quiet water. It felt longer. The first impact came from below, a probing bump that flexed the hull and spider-cracked the glass. Lori jerked back. Maris lost her footing. Someone laughed. Nerves more than anything. Water seeped through the fracture. Then, steadily, the guide moved for the controls, but the boat had already begun to settle unevenly. The boat listed as people shifted to keep balance, the stern dipping lower. Another bump pushed water harder through the cracked panel and along a seam near the floor. The leak turned into a steady inflow. That's when it broke down. The deck went slick. The boat listed harder. Maris slipped first, hitting the fractured panel as it gave further under her weight. The opening widened just enough. She slipped through. Tavio went in after her without hesitation. Weston followed seconds later when the boat lurched again and threw him off balance. Lori stayed on the high side, gripping what she could as the hull dipped further. The shark's behavior changed the moment they were in the water. Maris was closest. One bite, lower torso, not prolonged, just decisive. Tavio reached her and the shark came back from below. Contact at the leg and hip, a single grab and release. He didn't come back up the same way. Weston was hit next, across the back and right shoulder. Not held, but enough to open him up badly. The guide got a distress call out on a handheld radio and threw a cooler and life ring overboard as the boat continued taking on water. The vessel didn't shatter, it just settled lower as water filled it. No longer something you could stay on. A fishing vessel about 2 miles away reached the site in roughly 18 minutes. Tavio and Maris were both face down and unresponsive. Weston was conscious but losing blood fast. Lori was found on debris, physically unharmed. Maris died at the scene. The bite severed major abdominal vessels, and she bled out within minutes. Tavio couldn't be revived. Blood loss from the thigh and pelvic injuries was the cause. Weston survived. After surgery, but lost partial use of his right arm, Lori was treated for shock. The operator had no valid tour license. The fish scraps, the unrated glass panel, the lack of safety equipment, all of it came out in the review. Deaths were ruled accidental, with operator negligence cited. A waterproof camera near the debris had photos time-stamped up to 4 minutes before the first impact. The guide's radio log and the fishing vessel's GPS confirmed the rest. Case closed.
It was October 7, 2013, and Lake Kariba was sitting in the furnace heat that makes October the hardest month in Zimbabwe. The lake supports a very large population of Nile crocodiles, and in October the warm water has them at their most active. Rian Vermeulen, a 49-year-old mining contractor from Pretoria, had been doing an annual houseboat trip on Kariba with the same 3 friends for years. Same week, same boat, same skipper. The trip was the fixed point in all 4 calendars. The 1 week nobody's wife or job was allowed to touch. That skipper was Tendai Mlanga, 51, with 20 years on the lake, and his day 1 briefing never changed. Nobody on the lower swim deck at dawn or dusk. No limbs in the water, ever, no matter how hot it gets. The rule was short and completely non-negotiable, and for 4 days of fishing and drinking and sunburn, everybody followed it without thinking twice. The trip ran the way it always ran. Tigerfish in the morning, bream in the afternoon, the boat moving between bays while the heat built and broke. On the last evening, the boat sat anchored in a quiet bay with fish frying on the upper deck and the sun about half an hour from the horizon. Vermeulen took his beer down to the lower swim deck to cool off, sat on the edge, and let his feet trail in the water. His friends could hear him talking to them through the deck boards above, completely relaxed. 20 years of his own Kariba trips telling him this was fine. The water around the boat was glass calm, and the bay looked exactly as empty as it always did. Boat rules tend to be written in someone else's bad night, and when a skipper with 20 years on a lake tells me to keep my feet out of the water at dusk, My feet are staying so far from that water, they basically stop existing. Nile crocodiles are Africa's largest freshwater predator, the largest males approaching 16 feet, and they are ambush hunters built for exactly one move. They approach submerged and motionless, only eyes and nostrils above the surface, reading vibration and silhouette against the fading light, and they strike at the waterline. A swim deck at dusk puts a person at precisely crocodile strike height in the exact window when crocodiles hunt, with their feet broadcasting ripples into water they cannot see into. There was no warning of any kind. The crocodile took Vermeulen by the lower legs and pulled him straight off the deck. His friends heard the splash and one short scream and reached the deck within seconds, and one of them briefly caught his forearm before the crocodile rolled, tore him loose, and was gone. Witnesses aboard said they saw only a brief disturbance in the water before the surface went completely calm again, and that calm was somehow the worst part of the whole thing. Malanga had the spotlight sweeping the bay within a minute, and there was simply nothing to see. A search began at first light, the Friends and 2 other boats sweeping the bay and the shoreline downstream. Partial remains were recovered downstream the following day, consistent with crocodile predation according to the forensic examination. Malanga's documented briefing cleared him of any liability. Before the next charter went out, he repainted the lower deck rule directly onto the deck boards in red paint, where nobody could sit down without reading it. 4 days of following the rule. 1 beer on the last evening. It was April 27th, 2013, northern Florida. April, in that part of the state, is the last stretch of manageable weather before summer makes the outdoors genuinely difficult, warm without being brutal, the afternoons long and easy, the kind of day that makes outdoor fundraisers feel like a good idea. The zoo's spring event had drawn a modest crowd. Tents, folding tables, food vendors, along the main walkway. The atmosphere was low-key and pleasant, the kind of small community event that nobody photographs because there doesn't seem to be anything worth capturing. Elena Ruiz was 18, a first-year community college student from northern Florida, genuinely interested in veterinary work. She had attended several small wildlife fundraisers in the months before April 2013, informal, educational, low-key. She arrived at the spring fundraiser hosted by a small zoo without any particular concern. She was there to help set up, walk around, and support something she cared about. The zoo's main exhibit was a captive-bred southern cassowary, nearly 6 feet tall and approximately 130 pounds. Cassowaries are widely considered the most dangerous bird species in the world. The inner claw on each foot reaches up to 5 inches in length and is applied through powerful forward kicking strikes capable of lacerating organs and fracturing bone in a single contact. A cassowary does not build toward an attack the way many large animals do. It delivers one immediately, without graduated warning. The bird at this zoo had been displaying heightened territorial behavior during breeding season for weeks before the fundraiser, charging through fencing at handlers on multiple occasions. That's one of those warnings people tend to dismiss because the animal is a bird. I think if this had been a tiger or a lion, everyone would have paid closer attention. Staff were aware of the behavioral state. The event proceeded as scheduled. Volunteers were moving the cassowary into a temporary holding pen beside the visitor food tents, when a secondary latch on the holding gate, accidentally left unsecured after feed buckets were carried through, became the entire mechanism of failure. Not a policy breakdown, not an equipment fault. One latch, one moment of inattention. The cassowary forced the gate open and moved directly into the crowd near the main walkway. Elena was knocked to the ground during the initial panic as visitors scattered between vendor tents and parked vehicles. The cassowary delivered multiple downward strikes with its inner claw before staff managed to corner the bird near a wooded fence line. The open layout of a public event made intervention slower and more chaotic than a controlled enclosure would have allowed. Elena was transported by emergency crews and died from her injuries after leaving the scene. The zoo closed the following year not by regulatory order, but because it lost its insurance coverage following the investigation. What the case documents so precisely is a failure of proportionality in how danger is assessed. A small volunteer fundraiser, a modest zoo, a bird most people couldn't identify on sight. None of it registers as high risk until you understand what the animal was capable of, what behavioral state it was already in, and what a single unsecured latch meant in that context.